Welcome to the Unriveted podcast, where we talk about technology and digital transformation, artificial intelligence, and people. Today, this podcast is brought to you in part by, guess who, John? You know it. Do you want to say it or do you want me to say it?
Go for it.
All right. It is Wingnut Investments, where tightening the ROI is just a thumb screw away.
Oh, boy. Oh, wow.
I know. So, John, we have a guest, and I would like you to do the intro. Could you do us the honor?
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. So today we are joined on the Unriveted podcast by founder, CEO, and all-around hype man for Highlight, Jay Khatri. So welcome to the podcast, Jay. Thanks for joining Martin and myself. And
thanks for having me.
The way that we the way that we typically do these podcasts is we keep it pretty free form and just let the conversation flow where it likes. And we'll pick your brain on all topics that Martin discussed at the very beginning there. But I think the first thing we should do is turn it over to you so you can give us a little background on yourself, how you arrived at where you are today, and anything else you might feel is germane to today's podcast conversation.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, thanks Martin and John for having me. It was cool I just chatted with Martin a few weeks ago, and then he mentioned this and it sounded really interesting. So I'm excited to be on. My name's Jay Khatri. I run a company called Highlight.io. People can find us at Highlight.io. And we essentially do what we like to call full stack observability. Essentially, we have sort of a few main products, but our like sort of more core product is what is like a session replay product, which we sell to engineering teams to help them debug and understand issues happening across their stack. Since we started about 2 years ago, we built a bunch of like sort of adjacent products around it, such that, for example, when someone's debugging an issue on their front end, they can trace that all the way to something that's happening on the server side. And so, yeah, excited to talk about just general observability things. I know Martin has a lot of experience in that space. And in terms of the team, we're like 7 people at this point. We've been working on the product for about 2 years. And yeah, that's what we're up to.
That is super awesome, Jay. And just to have clarification, I consider myself Mr. Observability. It's just a humble title.
Fair enough. I should have said that. My bad.
Very humble.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. But it's a self-proclaimed title. There's no certification test, and it's an honor bestowed by myself. I appreciate you on here, and I've had the honor of checking out what Highlight does, and I'm actually quite intrigued and see the potential is very strong. I think this is a minor hole in the observability marketplace that you're fulfilling and doing it in a unique way. And I'd love for you to tell us, how did you get here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, it's actually been really quite a journey, to be honest. So like maybe 3 years ago, actually, I started another company, and our company went through YC. And during Y Combinator, you're like in this group of a bunch of other small startups, and you sort of kind of come up with a lot of it's cool because you get exposure into all the problems that other startups are having. And that's kind of what can, determine what you want to build and things like that, right? So a common problem that a lot of startups at the time were having is they were using like session replay tooling. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Hotjar and Full Story and sort of more of like the marketing tooling. And they were combining that with their observability tools, right? And so our idea at the beginning of Highlight was like, what if we sort of put those two things together so that early stage teams can use a session replay tool and understand what a user is doing on their site, but then also pair that with any sort of error log data that can help them actually debug and troubleshoot what's happening in the UI. So that was kind of the early idea behind Highlight. And I'd say for the first 6 months or so, it was an interesting sort of us finding ourselves and where we are in the market with respect to tools like the Full Story product type tools and the engineering tools. But ultimately, we found that selling this type of tool to engineers was particularly a unique value add to their existing observability tool chain. And then since then, we've kind of grown into becoming more and more of like a generic, like generalized monitoring tool, if that makes sense. But we get a lot of customers coming through sort of open source, modern JavaScript front end frameworks, just because of the idea that our tool is more starts from the front end in some sense.
Interesting. So I'll jump in with a question then. We like to go back and forth with our question asking. So
Sounds good.
Martin's background is Mr. Observability. I'm definitely not, self-proclaiming any titles on myself. My
Congrats on
area
the
of
title,
interest
by the
is
way,
more
Martin.
in like yeah, he's going to have a certificate on his wall behind him for the next podcast that says
Yeah.
that. So my interest and my area of interest and expertise is kind of in the machine learning AI space.
Okay.
Which obviously that's kind of the talk of the town right now in terms of pretty much anything that you throw a stone at in the software development world has AI attached to it, regardless of. So,
Yep.
my question to you then is thinking about your platform, and you've been around for going on almost 3 years, it looks like. So, have you seen any changes in client like asks or feature requests or anything that you've had to kind of adapt your product to in order to accommodate that very rapidly growing space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can answer it in two ways. The first way is that I think AI, if anything, has the combination of this sort of AI wave along with the hype around specific JavaScript frameworks have kind of really come together in some sense, where any new like AI engineer, if you want to call it, that's using like LangChain and the sort of like new hot AI libraries and stuff, often want to build something really quickly.
Right.
And so they pick tooling that's like easy to sort of spin up a web app and do things very quickly with, right? And so one of those things, for example, is Next.js. And I don't know if you guys know, but Next.js has this new like AI SDK they worked on recently, right? So we do actually get a lot of new companies coming through those channels. And naturally, those companies are actually tend to be in the AI space. So, for example, Vercel and Next.js, those types of tooling, we get a lot of inbound through that. So that's been really interesting. But it's interesting that we haven't really had to change our product to accommodate for those things, right? Because the idea of having like a framework that is on the front end and you need to send requests to your back end doesn't really change regardless of the industry to some extent. The second thing, though, that I would say is that like our team has been definitely experimenting a lot with using AI throughout our product. So, for example, we have an error monitoring product, and recently we've been actually sending like embeddings for all of our errors and exceptions to like we've been storing those embeddings such that we use, instead of grouping errors based on like a string match or whatever, we actually group them based on embeddings. So that's sort of like an experiment that we're running in the background. So imagine that a given error, you can say that I know based on semantically that it's a database error versus it's an authentication error. And so we're kind of doing a lot of experiments in that space. And that's, I think, just important generally because the AI ecosystem is growing and getting better so quickly that just our engineers being educated on how to use these sorts of APIs and understand how all this works, I think is really important. So yeah, the first part of the answer is basically the AI hype cycle, I think, has actually helped our business a lot because we've gotten a lot of people coming and trying to build these small apps, and our tool itself is very self-serve and developer friendly. But then on the second side of things, it's like, how can we as Highlight start to build AI into our product so that as we grow, we're on the cutting edge of what's available there.
Thank you, Jay. That's a really good way to describe this. And I think one thing that intrigues me is I think you have an open source component here and a commercialization component. Would you mind spending a moment describing, how you got to this path?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't mention this originally, but like our product is actually fully open source. So you can go to github.com/highlight/highlight, and the repo for our product is actually there. and the engineers on our team that are working on our product are actively working on it in public. So there's a bunch of benefits from that, right? Like our roadmap is public, our code is obviously public, but then also like the specification for sending data to Highlight is public. So we have a lot of engineers that don't work at Highlight that basically build for our platform because they're at a large company and they want to start sending telemetry data to us or whatever. So I think that was honestly the original, the third part was the original inkling for what we wanted to build here, because there are a lot of open source specifications for observability that I don't think are actually used to their full extent. So one of the things that we rely on, for example, is open telemetry. And we get a lot of the folks from the open telemetry community excited about Highlight through that sort of channel. And so, yeah, in general, that was the original idea. Like, we want to build a community around an open source specification around sending data from your observability stack to Highlight. And obviously we have a preference for like more modern frameworks, but yeah, that was the original idea from it. And yeah, since then there've been a lot of benefits, which I just mentioned, and it's been pretty exciting.
Are you turning over to me, Martin? Now I'm trying to think of a good question to ask. So
this is how we stump the host.
Well, let me finish. Actually. So Martin asked about open source, but then he also asked about commercialization, which I didn't mention, right? So in terms of how Highlight makes money, which I think is, is important as a business, is that we have a hosted version of our product. So on our GitHub repo, for example, if you don't want to like run Highlight in a bunch of Docker containers and have to manage it yourself, you can basically go to our hosted product, which is where we make most of our revenue from. The people come on there, they can swipe a credit card and they can just start using our product. I think a really interesting thing that I actually talked to Martin about a couple of weeks back is companies like GitLab actually don't make money from that sort of model. They make money from like a licensing fee on their repo, meaning, or at least at the beginning, they did most of that, right? So I think that's something that we haven't done so far, but it's something we're considering. But yeah, so far the commercialization has been mostly on our hosted product. And I mean, it'll be exciting to see sort of as we get more enterprise interest and as we talk to more like sort of enterprises in healthcare and fintech and things like that, what their interest level looks like in terms of being able to self-host the product.
That's actually a really good segue to like the next way to look at this is the potential of you being a plugin or a connector to yet another observability vendor on the market already that is commercialized. You could be positioned really well there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we do already have a lot of customers that use us alongside sort of more like, for example, I don't know, y'all are probably familiar with Honeycomb, right? Honeycomb's a great tracing product, yes. and they're like very specialized in the tracing realm, right? So we have a lot of customers that use Highlight for their client side recording and error tracking, but then use it alongside Honeycomb and kind of can pass trace IDs back and forth, if that makes sense, right? So I think that, in my opinion, and how I think about it is we're not really a gateway necessarily for like observability data. I think at the end of the day, we do want our customers coming to our app to see the data. But I think you're right, Martin, a lot of opportunities for us to like work with other bigger companies to basically, enhance and augment the experience for their respective products.
I could see it. And also the cloud providers, they're silently in observability, but they don't really tout it.
Yeah.
They're there.
They are. And I mean, but for whatever reason, I think they just don't focus as much on it because it's not really their business, I guess that's to some extent, it could be like long-term a thing where we're on like the AWS marketplace, for example, and people can just like spin up Highlight there, So I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of just like growth in partnerships.
Very good. John, as a host, you must have something just burning.
Yeah, I think I told you I pride myself on being able to come up with great questions on the fly. I said that to Martin the other day, and usually I am, and now I'm kind of like stumped because he's the Mr. Observability, right? And I'm
Martin is Mr. Observability.
Tangentially involved.
He said it himself.
Well, here's a question then. All right, and it's it might not necessarily pertain precisely to your offering, but your thoughts I'm always interested in. So I became involved in software development, AI, data science, kind of on my own, right? I didn't go to school for it. I wasn't professionally trained in it, but I have developed that over the years just by working in roles, and that's the best experience, right? So one
Yep.
of the things that I've always had issue with when there's an error or an issue with the code execution, and you get like a trace back or some error message or exception that's thrown, and the interpretation of that exception. So one of the things I've always wondered is, like, sometimes I feel like the message that you're given when an issue does occur is sometimes itself very hard to interpret, and maybe that's just from my lack of 30 years of experience writing code every day. But I've always wondered if there's like a better way that we could give more like natural language responses for an issue. So thinking about that, maybe just your perspective on adding something to like the observability capabilities of your tool or any tool, to be able to tell people in a natural, easily understood response to when something occurs. So rather than throw like an error code and some random stream of digits that you ultimately just have to go online and look up on like Stack Overflow or the manual or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Is there any interest in that? Or I don't know if, hopefully what I'm trying to ask makes sense.
I think, yeah, I think
And I think
it,
too with like large
no, no,
well,
I think it
Martin
makes
doesn't get
sense.
it, but
No,
I,
no.
I, I think it
There's a
makes
whole
sense.
product idea that
okay. Well, all right. Well, I'll turn it over to you. Tell me what you think in that
Sounds
regard.
good. And yeah, and I'll let Martin chime in. I think he wanted to say something too. But yeah, so my thoughts my thoughts are that, like, I think our philosophy around the company has always been around this idea of like cohesion, which is the idea that, like, one, like like a stack trace is never enough. In other words, you can't just debug an issue from looking at a stack trace. In maybe one out of like 200 times, maybe you can. But beyond that, what you need is you actually need context in terms of what went on before and after the error around your stack, right? And so that's kind of like what we're building here, which is the idea that, in, let's say you have a Python backend, John, that's doing some AI inference or something like that, and then you have a JavaScript front end, right? And the JavaScript front end is calling the backend, right? But there's an error on your backend. Imagine if you could know that Martin maybe clicked on your site in a specific part, which triggered the error in the first place, you know? And so, in some sense, it doesn't exactly answer your question with respect to like summarizing an error with AI and stuff like that. But
Right.
I think there is like a long-term goal, and I think it's not doable, that you can actually summarize what happened around an error to give an engineer full context in a more like semantic sense. So we've tried this actually in some ways. When ChatGPT, the APIs came out, maybe like 6 months ago or whatever, right? We tried to basically take a user session, and describe it. But turns out it's like we're not there yet. I think like there's a lot to work to be done on that front. But yeah, like we're constantly, and I'm sure other observability vendors are doing the same thing, where we're trying to make it as easy as people can to sort of debug these issues in a way where they don't have to be clicking through 7 different products, and can get as much information they can in like a readable context, you know? So I do agree with the premise.
Right.
I think we're not there yet, in my opinion, but I think we're getting there. Yeah, I think we're not that far. Martin, you had something to add, I think.
absolutely. We're about to wrap up, but let me go. I think there's a productization idea in the making here, John and Jay. Clearly, if we can just throw the garbage into the LLM, and it's a mix of time series and event data, and we could train it on how to handle the time series and the event data, along with the lookups of the things around the numbers that go with those things called exceptions. And you can come up with something for sure, guarantee it. And then it could come out with a nice SMS message that says, "Welcome, John. You have mail." 500 exception error, go to the server and restart it. There you go. I know that's not rocket science, that part, but to get more contextually into what happened building into it, definitely, I think there's a play here.
Yeah, I think also like Stack Overflow, for example, like they started actually recently charging for their data set. And imagine if you could, as a error monitoring product like Highlight, start to look at an error stack trace and all the things that went around it, and then ask the LLM, hey, can you find me a relevant document in Stack Overflow? And then you actually can give someone like almost like you know how like ChatGPT now will give you like what is it called? When they'll like link you back to the original document. That I think could be really cool and is maybe a step in the direction of what Martin just said. So lots of exciting things happening on that front, I think, for sure. And we're not even close to seeing exactly what it turns into.
Agreed.
Perfect.
So thank you for joining us on the Unriveted podcast. And on behalf of John and I, we really appreciate it. And for that, we're going to call lights out. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Bye.